In this video, I'm going to be talking about a topic that is wildly misunderstood, and that topic is addiction. This is information that I wish I knew about 5 or 6 years ago when I was really struggling with trying to move through my own addictions, and this information was something that completely changed my life and my trajectory of my healing and my recovery. I really want to first start out by saying that I'm not a doctor and I'm not a psychologist. In fact, I left my counseling psychology master's degree halfway through because I was struggling so much myself with this issue. And this is the thing when it comes to addiction. When we think of addiction, we think of addicts that struggle with substance abuse or struggle with drugs and alcohol, or maybe even some other addictions as well. But with that, we completely often look or disregard the other types of addictions that are out there. Phone addiction, gambling, shopping. There are so many different types of addictions that we can find ourselves doing. And when we place only, though that type of addiction goes into that box, or that one goes into that box, or that one, we completely miss the underlying root cause often, because when we do that, we start seeing, we start looking at the symptom, we start focusing at the symptom itself. I can't stop drinking, or I can't stop shopping, or I can't stop looking at my phone, or I can't stop eating chocolate. And we focus, we zero in on that one symptom versus looking at where does this actually come from? Because when we start looking again underneath the surface, we start seeing that this is a method, or this is a coping strategy to get away from emotional pain. It's a way for us to regulate our nervous systems when we distract ourselves with external stimulus in order to get away from what's going on the inside in order to cope. And this is what is so important to understand when we look at different behavioral patterns and different ways of being that we're not very happy with, and we wish we could stop. We wish they would just go away, but we can't stop. It's usually something deeper. It's usually something that has to do with emotional distress and nervous system dysregulation that most often comes from somewhere in our childhood or somewhere along the way of growing up, where we experienced something that was hurtful, that was painful, and we weren't able to process or digest the emotions. We started believing certain things about ourselves that made it so it was very conducive to continue going to coping mechanisms like video game playing or drinking. Those habits and those patterns became protective patterns to keep us away from emotional pain and hurt and a dysregulated nervous system. And this is why it is so important, and why I wish I had this understanding before, because all through my 20s, I tried healing from substance abuse, from dysfunctional relationship patterns, from food addiction and binge eating. And when I started seeing later on, after going through many different recovery treatments and seeing psychologists and psychiatrists who never told me that to look at my past, who didn't bring up things like the ACE study, which is the adverse childhood experiences study that saw that people who struggle or crime in the US, people who perpetrated crime in the US, they most often came from backgrounds that were really heavy and that were difficult and emotionally taxing for the nervous system. And people who struggled with addictions as well, most people, they found in the study that they came from adverse childhood experiences, which indicates that the issue, the root cause of addiction and really destructive behaviors doesn't come from there being something wrong with someone, or that there being some sort of disease or even a genetic disease. It often comes from trauma, the inability to cope with emotional pain, and then needing to control our environment or seek something outside of ourselves in order to soothe, in order to feel better within ourselves, because we don't have the capacity to be with our emotional hurt and pain. And this is what I want to continue going into when it comes to healing and recovery. It's not helpful, at least it wasn't for me, to look at addiction as something that was wrong with me, a disease, something that was bad or shameful even, that there was this uncontrollable part of me that I needed to be in like at war with. That just didn't resonate with me, because when I started coming to understand trauma and understand the nervous system, and I started reading and I started going through completely different practices of healing versus what I'd done before in my recovery process growing up in the States, I started coming to realize that all I had to do was to start looking at my past with emotional hurt and pain. I started having to heal my inner child. I started having to look at these feelings of shame and guilt and grief and anger that I hadn't been in contact with, that my body very brilliantly had pushed aside because it was so overwhelming, and I didn't have the tools and the support that I needed in order to move through and digest and process those emotions and release those really disempowering, horrible beliefs that I'd started believing about myself. And with that, I started realizing, well, of course I went to something like substance abuse, like binge drinking, like relationships that weren't good for me because they felt safe in some way. They were what I knew. They were my way of coping. But the problem was that might have been a way of coping. That way might have been a way of, going to what was safe for my younger self, my inner child. It doesn't mean that it's something that is healthy for my future, right? So while it's a coping mechanism that's brilliant and helpful in the moment of getting away from different emotional hurt, it's also not something that we want to continue doing, obviously. And when it comes to healing and recovery, of substance abuse or relationship addiction, love addiction, for example, or food addictions, we have to start understanding our own nervous system and our own emotions and start relating it back to where in the past did I maybe start using something to distract myself, something to numb myself out from emotional pain. And what was that emotional pain? What are the different emotions that are maybe still stuck in my body, in my system somewhere, that need help, that need processing, that need space to allow to come through, so that the desire to seek these addictions and these substances or whatever it might be isn't as alluring. And this is where education is so important, because when we start reading books about, for example, shame, or for example, trauma, or the nervous system, we start seeing that, okay, it makes sense that I used to start doing this at some point in time, and I understand how these things are put together and why it happened. And through that, we are then able to create more understanding for ourselves and more compassion. So with that, I'm actually going to recommend 2 books that I've picked up along the way that have been really, really helpful on this journey. And number 1 is Healing the Shame That Binds You. This book is incredible for anyone who feels they have a shame-based programming, in the sense like they have shame-based beliefs about themselves, who might have felt or feels a lot of perfectionism and self-criticism, and that also then can lead to certain a certain need to numb out or avoid or distract. This book is incredible, by John Bradshaw. Absolutely recommend for anyone. The next one is The Primal Wound. This is more of a psychological book, but it's an incredible understanding of seeing addiction as a response to the sense of non-being that we might have experienced as children if we didn't have parents or caregivers who mirrored us and made space for our emotions, who validated and were empathetically with us and compassionate with us. Because that way, if we didn't have that, if we experienced a lot of punishment or the sense of I don't exist to my parents, or I'm not important to my parents, that could have created a deep wound within us, or a sense of a sense of non-beingness, as this book says. And the hope here is that healing is so possible. Healing these different patterns, healing the parts of us that are engaging in addictive patterns. Like, for example, when you look at addiction, we'll see that it's often a part of us that's trying to get away from emotional pain. And then there's also an inner critic often that's judging us for the habits that we do. It's shaming us for eating that chocolate every single day, or drinking, or whatever it might be. We have a part of us that's like, oh, I shouldn't do that, and that's really, really bad. And what happens then, it just continues this cycle of addiction where we continue repeating the patterns because a part of us wants to get away from the emotional hurt, and often wants to get away from the part of us that is judging and is shaming. And it just continues this cycle. What we have to do is go underneath the surface of understanding where it comes from and take care of those parts of ourselves that need help, that need compassion, that need awareness. Because underneath those different parts of us that are just trying to survive, the part that's wanting to avoid is just trying to survive. The part that's actually criticizing and shaming is also just trying to survive. And then underneath that, we usually have the wound itself. We have our younger selves, our inner children that are hurting. And the parts of us on top of them that are just trying to get away from the emotional pain of our inner children, they're not allowing us to look at and feel and be with the parts of ourselves that really need our help. And this is where it comes into internal family systems, which is what I'm speaking to largely here. Internal family systems is an incredible model that helped me immensely when it came to healing my addictive patterns, because this model is so gentle, it's so compassionate, it's so understanding that these are just different parts doing the best they can. And when we can create understanding and curiosity and compassion for these different parts of us, we actually are way better off moving through recovery, because we're not kind of shame-ridden. We're not feeling like there's something wrong with us. Everything we're doing is making sense on some level. And this just comes back to also that we have to be willing to look at ourselves. We have to be willing to build capacity in ourselves and our nervous systems to meet these things within ourselves, because it's difficult work. There's no lie, it is difficult work. And it's not something that happens overnight. We have to take an approach of a titrated process, meaning titration being we do it piece by piece, do like a little at a time, so we can slowly but surely build our capacity to be with the things that are uncomfortable on the inside. The hope here is that we come home to ourselves through that process, but it's through that we have to go, not an avoidance of it and not in a way of shaming ourselves through it. So I hope that this video was helpful. I know that this is a subject I'm going to go way deeper into in future videos because it's so important, and I see this being such a big issue for so many people. in the sense that we feel like we have to distract ourselves from ourselves. And the hope again is that we come home to ourselves and we come home to the safety and the ability to regulate ourselves through any type of discomfort that would in the past lead us to go to different addictions, addictive patterns. So like I said, I hope this video was helpful. I'm going to drop the resources underneath, and I really want to encourage anyone who is experiencing this at the moment, or they're wanting to go deeper with their recovery, read the books, seek support from people who understand trauma, who understand emotional hurt, who understand nervous system work. Those are the people that are going to be the best support in your journey of coming home to yourself. So if that's a therapist or a coach or friends who understand the deeper rooted things going on here, those are the people that you want to be around. Okay, I'm gonna go, but thank you for watching, and I'm wishing you so much health and love on your own journey.